September 3rd, 1260. The morning sun rose over the Jezreel Valley in southeastern Galilee, illuminating a landscape that would soon become the stage for one of history's most consequential battles. Near a spring called Ain Jalut, the Spring of Goliath, two armies prepared to clash in a confrontation that would determine the fate of the Islamic world and halt the seemingly unstoppable westward expansion of the Mongol Empire. The Mamluk general Baybars sat astride his horse on a low rise, surveying the terrain he knew intimately from his years as a fugitive in these very hills. Behind him, concealed among the trees and folds of the highlands, waited the main Mamluk army under Sultan Qutuz. Before him stretched the valley floor where, within hours, the fate of Egypt, Syria, and perhaps all of Islam would be decided. The Mongols were coming. Everyone knew it. The only question was whether the Mamluks could stop what no army had successfully stopped in 43 years of conquest. To understand how this moment came to be, we must go back 2 years to February 1258, when the Mongol army under Hulagu Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan, stood before the walls of Baghdad. For 5 centuries, Baghdad had been the jewel of the Islamic world, home to the Abbasid Caliphate and seat of Islamic political and religious authority. The city's libraries contain the accumulated wisdom of Islamic civilization. Its streets bustled with scholars, poets, merchants, and pilgrims from across the Muslim world. All of that was about to end in fire and blood. The Mongol siege engines hurled massive stones against Baghdad's walls day and night. Chinese engineers, conscripted into Mongol service, constructed catapults and trebuchets that could smash through fortifications that had stood for generations. When the walls finally broke, the Mongol army poured through like a flood of death. What followed was systematic annihilation. Contemporary chronicles speak of rivers running black with ink from the destroyed libraries and red with blood from the slaughtered inhabitants. The last Abbasid caliph, al-Mustasim, was executed. Some sources say wrapped in carpets and trampled by horses, so his royal blood would not touch the ground. Between 200,000 and 1,000 people died in the sack of Baghdad, though exact numbers are impossible to verify. What is certain is that the spiritual and political centre of Islam had been obliterated. The fall of Baghdad sent shockwaves throughout the Islamic world. If the great city could fall, if the caliph himself could be killed, then nowhere was safe. The Mongols had already conquered China, subjugated Russia, devastated Eastern Europe, and destroyed the Khwarezmian Empire. Now they had eliminated the Abbasid Caliphate. Their reputation for invincibility seemed well earned. Mongol armies never lost. When they were defeated, which was rare, they always returned with overwhelming force to exact terrible vengeance. After Baghdad, Hulagu turned his attention westward towards Syria. His army crossed the Euphrates River in late 1259, bolstered by Christian allies. The Armenian kingdom of Cilicia under King Hethum provided troops, as did the Principality of Antioch under Bohemond VI. These Christian rulers saw the Mongols as potential allies against their Muslim neighbours, despite the apocalyptic destruction the Mongols had wrought elsewhere. The Georgian kingdom also contributed forces, swelling Hulagu's army to perhaps 120,000 men, though exact figures are disputed. The Syrian city of Aleppo was first. The siege began on January 18, 1260, and the Mongols employed their full arsenal of siege warfare techniques perfected over decades of conquest. Catapults launched stones and incendiaries over the walls, sappers dug beneath the fortifications. Wave after wave of assault troops scaled ladders under covering fire from massed archers. On January 24th, after just 6 days, Aleppo fell. What followed was the standard Mongol practice, systematic massacre of the population to terrorize other cities into immediate surrender. The citadel held out one more day before capitulating on January 25th. The great city of Aleppo was reduced to a charnel house. Next came Damascus, the ancient city that had served as capital of the Ayyubid Sultanate. But Damascus would not share Aleppo's fate. When Hulagu dispatched his subordinate general Kitbuka Noyan with a vanguard to assess the city, the population and local elites emerged seeking terms of amnesty without resistance. Kitbuka, a Nestorian Christian of Naiman Turkic descent, accepted their surrender. On March 1st, 1260, Mongol forces entered Damascus peacefully. For the first time in Mongol history in this region, a major city had been taken without destruction, though this mercy was as much practical as magnanimous. Damascus would serve as a useful administrative centre for Mongol rule in Syria. With Syria secured, the road to Egypt lay open. The Mamluk Sultanate in Cairo was the last significant Muslim power remaining in the Middle East. Hulagu prepared to complete his conquest, but then came news that would change everything. Mungka Khan, the great Khan of the Mongol Empire, had died in August 1259 while campaigning against the Song dynasty in China. Mongol tradition required Hulagu to return to Mongolia to participate in the Kurultai, the council that would elect the next great Khan. More importantly, Hulagu needed to be present to protect his own interests in the succession dispute. His brother Kublai and his younger brother Arik Böke were already manoeuvring for position. Hulagu faced a difficult decision. He had come so close to completing the conquest of the Middle East. Egypt was vulnerable, isolated, seemingly ripe for the taking. But Mongol politics were brutal, and absence from the succession could mean losing everything. In the end, Hulagu withdrew with the bulk of his army, perhaps 90,000 men or more, leaving behind only a token force to hold Syria and prepare for the eventual conquest of Egypt. This force, numbering somewhere between 10,000 and 20,000 men, was placed under the command of Kitbuka. It was both a tremendous responsibility and an impossible situation. Kitbuka was a veteran commander who had served loyally under Hulagu for years. He had participated in the sieges of the Nizari Ismaili fortresses in Persia in 1252, had commanded one of the flanks during the sack of Baghdad, and had accepted the surrender of Damascus. According to the Armenian chronicler Hayton of Coriacus, Kitbuka held the land in peace and greatly loved and honoured the Christians, supposedly because he was descended from the three kings who had come to worship the infant Jesus. Whether this genealogical claim was true or propaganda, Kitbuka was certainly a Christian, a rarity in the Mongol command structure, and he saw himself as a liberator of the Holy Land from Muslim rule. But Kitbuka's force was far too small to conquer Egypt. The Mamluk Sultanate could field armies many times larger than the garrison Kitbuka commanded. Moreover, maintaining Mongol control over Syria was proving difficult. The largely Muslim population resented their new overlords, particularly the presence of Christian troops from Armenia and Georgia. When an uprising broke out in Damascus, Kitbuka had to divert forces to suppress it, further weakening his already inadequate strength. Despite these challenges, Kitbuka attempted to continue Mongol pressure on Egypt, sending raiding parties south toward Gaza, where a small Mongol garrison of about 1,000 troops was established. In Cairo, Sultan Qutuz watched these developments with a mixture of fear and calculation. Qutuz himself was a Mamluk, one of the slave soldiers who had been purchased as boys from the steppes north of the Black Sea, converted to Islam, and trained in intensive military schools to become the elite warrior class of Egypt. The Mamluks had only recently taken power, overthrowing their Ayyubid masters in 1250 and establishing their own sultanate. They were still consolidating their rule when the Mongol threat emerged. When Hulagu's envoys arrived in Cairo in early 1260 bearing the standard Mongol ultimatum, surrender or be destroyed, Qutuz made a decision that revealed either tremendous courage or reckless desperation. He had the envoys executed and their heads displayed on the Bab Zuwayla, one of Cairo's great gates. This was not merely defiance, it was a declaration of total war. The Mongols always avenged such insults with overwhelming force. By killing Hulagu's envoys, Qutuz had committed his sultanate to fight to the death. But Qutuz had also been calculating. He had learned through his intelligence network that Hulagu had departed with most of his army. The Mongol force remaining in Syria was relatively small, perhaps no more than 20,000 men. If the Mamluks could strike quickly before Hulagu returned with reinforcements, they might have a chance. It was a desperate gamble, but the alternative was to wait passively for Hulagu to return with his full strength and crush Egypt as thoroughly as he had crushed Baghdad. Qutuz assembled a large army in Cairo, perhaps 120,000 men by some estimates, though modern historians suggest the actual number was probably closer to 20,000 to 30,000. Whatever the exact figure, the Mamluk army was formidable. At its core were the royal Mamluks, the Sultan's personal slave soldiers, numbering perhaps 12,000. These were the elite, the best trained and best equipped cavalry in the Muslim world. They had learned their trade in the Furusiyya schools, intensive training programs that combined physical conditioning, horsemanship, archery, swordsmanship, and tactical doctrine into a comprehensive martial education. The Furusiyya was more than just military training. It was a complete philosophy of cavalry warfare that addressed every aspect of mounted combat, from the care and training of horses to the moral virtues expected of a warrior. Mamluk cavalrymen trained with composite bows that could shoot over long distances with devastating accuracy. They practiced mounted archery until they could hit targets while galloping at full speed. They learned to wield the keelage, the curved sabre optimized for slashing strikes from horseback. They mastered the lance charge, the coordinated maneuver where heavy cavalry would smash into enemy formations with overwhelming shock impact. Beyond the royal Mamluks were auxiliary forces, Bedouin tribesmen who served as scouts and light cavalry, Turkoman horsemen from the steppes who understood the nomadic style of warfare, Arab levies who provided additional numbers, and various Syrian refugees who had fled the Mongol conquest and now sought revenge. These auxiliaries were not as highly trained or well equipped as the royal Mamluks, but they added depth and versatility to the army. One of Qutuz's most important decisions was to ally with Baybars, a fellow Mamluk who had fled Syria after the Mongols captured Damascus. Baybars was brilliant, ambitious, and dangerous, exactly the kind of man who could be a tremendous asset or a deadly threat. Qutuz chose to make him an asset, appointing Baybars as one of his key commanders. This decision would have enormous consequences, both for the coming battle and for Qutuz personally. On July 26, 1260, the Mamluk army departed Cairo and marched north toward Palestine. Their route would take them through territory controlled by the remnants of the Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem, now centered on the coastal city of Acre. The Crusaders faced a delicate diplomatic situation. The Mongols had sought their alliance, promising to help them reclaim Jerusalem from Muslim control. The Mamluks were their traditional enemies, the Muslim warriors who had been slowly conquering Crusader territories for decades. Logic suggested the Crusaders should side with the Mongols, but the Crusaders had also witnessed what Mongol alliance meant. They had seen what happened to cities that opened their gates to Mongol armies. They had watched as Armenian and Antiochian troops marched alongside the Mongols into Damascus, only to see those same Christian allies treated as subordinates in a vast empire where non-Mongols, regardless of religion, would always be second-class citizens. Moreover, the Mongols seemed the greater long-term threat. If the Mongols conquered Egypt, they would control the entire region, and the Crusader states would exist only at Mongol sufferance. So the Crusaders made a pragmatic choice. They declared neutrality, but it was a neutrality that heavily favoured the Mamluks. When Qutuz's army reached Crusader territory, they were allowed free passage. The Mamluks camped outside Acre and were resupplied with food and water. Baybars himself, along with several Muslim notables, was invited into the city as a guest of honour. This passive alliance gave the Mamluks a crucial advantage, secure supply lines and a safe staging area from which to advance against the Mongols. As the Mamluk army moved north through Galilee toward the Jordan River Valley, Kitbuka received intelligence reports about their approach. His scouts estimated the size of the Mamluk force and confirmed that Sultan Qutuz himself was in command. Kitbuka knew he was outnumbered, perhaps by as much as 5-1, though some modern historians suggest the numerical disparity was less extreme. Either way, the strategic situation was dire. A prudent commander might have withdrawn, fallen back to more defensible positions, sent urgent messages to Hulagu requesting reinforcements, and waited for the odds to improve. But Kitbuka was not a man inclined toward retreat. He had never tasted defeat. The Mongol military tradition emphasized aggressive offensive action, and withdrawal in the face of the enemy was considered shameful. Moreover, Kitbuka may have believed, as many Mongols did, in the essential superiority of Mongol warriors over sedentary peoples. The Mamluks might have more men, but Mongol tactics, discipline and ferocity had overcome numerical disadvantages countless times before. Kitbuka could not mobilize immediately. First, he had to put down the uprising in Damascus, pacifying the rebellious Muslim population that resented Mongol and Christian occupation. Once order was restored, he gathered his forces and marched south, with an army that probably numbered between 10,000 and 20,000 men. His force included not just Mongols but also Georgian cavalry, Armenian troops provided by King Hethum, and Syrian auxiliaries from Ayyubid princes who had submitted to Mongol authority. Kitbuka was concerned about the loyalty of these Syrian troops and kept them in reserve, fearing they might defect to the Mamluks during battle. The two armies converged on the Jezreel Valley in early September 1260. The location that would host their confrontation, Ain Jalut, was rich with historical and religious significance. The spring, whose name meant Spring of Goliath, was traditionally identified as the place where the young David had slain the Philistine giant Goliath centuries before. Now another David was preparing to face another Goliath, though in this confrontation it was unclear which side was which. The terrain offered significant tactical opportunities. The valley floor provided excellent ground for cavalry operations, with ample water from the spring to supply horses and men. The slopes of Mount Gilboa secured one flank and provided commanding observation points. The nearby hill of Moray offered similar advantages. Trees dotted the highlands, providing concealment for troops waiting in ambush. For a commander who understood the ground, this landscape could be transformed into a deadly trap. Baybars understood the ground intimately. He had spent time in this region years earlier as a fugitive, fleeing political enemies and learning every fold of earth, every grove of trees, every hidden approach. When the Mamluk army reached the area on September 2nd or early September 3rd, Baybars recognized immediately how the terrain could be exploited. He proposed a strategy to Sultan Qutuz that was both brilliant and extremely risky. The plan was to use one of the Mongols' own favourite tactics against them, the feigned retreat. Mongol armies had employed this manoeuvre countless times with devastating success. A small force would engage the enemy, fight briefly, then appear to break and flee in disorder. The enemy, seeing apparent victory within reach, would pursue aggressively, abandoning formation and discipline in their eagerness to complete the rout. Then the fleeing force would lead their pursuers into a carefully prepared ambush where the main army waited. Envelopment and annihilation would follow. The tactic required perfect coordination, iron discipline, and nerves of steel. The troops conducting the feigned retreat had to appear genuinely panicked, while actually maintaining enough cohesion to lead the enemy exactly where they needed to go. The main force had to remain perfectly concealed until the precise moment to spring the trap. If the enemy suspected the ruse, if they stopped their pursuit short of the ambush zone, if the timing was even slightly off, the tactic could fail catastrophically. Qutuz agreed to the plan. The bulk of the Mamluk army, perhaps 15,000 men or more, was concealed in the highlands surrounding the valley. They hid among the trees on the slopes of Mount Gilboa and behind other terrain features, positioned to attack from multiple directions once the signal was given. Baybars took command of a smaller vanguard, perhaps 3,000 to 5,000 cavalry, and positioned them on the valley floor where they would be visible to the approaching Mongols. The Mamluk positioning was also carefully chosen to exploit the sun. They arranged themselves so that when battle was joined, the Mongols would be facing the rising sun, making it difficult for them to see Mamluk movements clearly. Every small advantage mattered when facing an enemy as skilled and dangerous as the Mongols. On the morning of September 3rd, 1260, Kitbuka's Mongol army entered the Jezreel Valley and spotted Baybars' vanguard. The Mongol commander would have made rapid tactical assessments. The enemy force visible before him appeared relatively small, certainly smaller than intelligence reports had suggested for the overall Mamluk army. Where was the rest? Were they approaching from another direction? Had they not yet arrived? Or was this an ambush? Mongol commanders were not naive. They had used the feigned retreat tactic themselves many times, and had certainly encountered it used against them. Kitbuka would have been alert to the possibility of deception, but he also faced pressure to engage. He could not simply sit in Syria indefinitely with his small force while the Mamluks manoeuvred. Eventually Hulagu would return, but there was no telling when that would be, and in the meantime Kitbuka had to demonstrate that Mongol rule over Syria was secure and that Muslim armies could not operate with impunity in Mongol territory. The decision was made. The Mongols would attack. This decision reveals both the confidence and perhaps the hubris of Mongol military culture. They had never lost a major engagement in this region. Their tactics, honed over decades of conquest across Eurasia, had proven superior to every enemy they had faced. The Mamluks might have numbers, but numbers alone had never been enough to defeat Mongol discipline, mobility, and firepower. The Mongol army advanced toward Baybars' position. Their approach would have been methodical and professional. Mongol cavalry operated with a level of discipline and coordination that most medieval armies could not match. They moved in organized units called tumens, each consisting of 10,000 men, though actual strengths were often lower. Within each tumen were smaller units of 1,000, 100, and finally 10 men, creating a hierarchical command structure that allowed for both unified action and tactical flexibility. As they closed the distance, the Mongols would have begun their standard attack pattern. First came the light cavalry horse archers, mounted on small, hardy Mongol ponies that could survive on minimal fodder and cover enormous distances without tiring. These archers were armed with composite bows of revolutionary design, constructed from layers of horn, wood, and sinew bound together with animal glue. These bows were compact enough to use effectively from horseback, yet powerful enough to shoot arrows over 300 yards, farther than the English longbow that would later dominate European battlefields. The Mongol archers used a thumb draw technique protected by a horn or leather ring, allowing them to maintain rapid rates of fire. Each warrior carried multiple quivers with different types of arrows: standard arrows for unarmoured targets, armour-piercing arrows, with hardened metal heads for penetrating mail and plate, and specialised arrows including incendiaries and whistling arrows, whose eerie sound was designed to terrorise enemies. They would ride toward the enemy in waves, shooting volleys of arrows, then wheeling away before the enemy could close for melee combat. This hit-and-run approach could decimate enemy formations while keeping Mongol casualties minimal. Behind the light cavalry came the heavy cavalry, the shock troops who would deliver the decisive blow once the enemy was sufficiently weakened and disorganised by archery. These warriors wore armour of laminated leather or iron plates, carried shields, and were armed with lances, sabres, and maces for close combat. Their horses were larger and stronger than those of the light cavalry, bred to carry the weight of an armoured warrior and deliver devastating impact during a charge. When the Mongols engaged Baybars' vanguard, the initial clash was ferocious. The Mamluks were also expert cavalry, equally skilled in mounted archery and close combat. They answered Mongol arrows with their own volleys, fired from powerful composite bows similar in design to those used by the Mongols. Mamluk warriors wore armour of mail or lamella plate and carried shields for protection. They were trained to fight in formation, maintaining cohesion even under intense pressure. For several hours the two forces clashed in the classic pattern of cavalry warfare. Groups of horsemen would charge forward, loose arrows, then wheel away. Individual warriors would engage in brief melees before disengaging. The valley floor became a swirling chaos of horses and men, dust rising in clouds, the air filled with the thunder of hooves, the snap of bowstrings, and the screams of wounded men and animals. But gradually Baybars began to implement his plan. His troops started to give ground, slowly at first, then more quickly. The withdrawal appeared genuine, as though the Mamluks were being overwhelmed by Mongol ferocity. Wounded men fell from their horses. Riderless mounts galloped in panic across the battlefield. The Mamluk formation began to fragment as units retreated at different rates. Every signal suggested a force on the verge of breaking completely. Kitbuka saw what appeared to be victory within reach. The enemy vanguard was collapsing. If he pressed the attack now, he could turn this into a rout, pursue the fleeing Mamluks, and destroy them in detail. The decision seemed obvious. He ordered a general advance. This was the critical moment. The Mongol army, including forces that Kitbuka had held in reserve, surged forward in pursuit of the apparently defeated Mamluks. Discipline held, but the pursuit naturally spread the Mongol formation out as faster units pulled ahead and slower ones lagged behind. The Mongols entered the killing zone, advancing deeper into the valley where Kutuz had positioned his hidden forces. Baybars led his men in their carefully choreographed retreat, drawing the Mongols toward the ambush. The performance had to be perfect, retreat fast enough to encourage pursuit, but not so fast that contact was lost, appear disorganized, but actually maintain enough cohesion to execute the next phase of the plan. It was military theatre of the highest order, and Baybars, whatever his other qualities, was a master of such operations. The pursuing Mongols, focused on the fleeing enemy before them, may have failed to notice subtle signals that should have raised alarm. The supposedly routed Mamluks were retreating in a specific direction, funneling toward a particular section of the valley. The terrain was becoming more constrained, with hills pressing closer on either side. Birds startled from trees on the slopes, perhaps disturbed by concealed troops waiting among the branches, and then the trap was sprung. From multiple directions simultaneously, the hidden Mamluk forces burst from concealment. Cavalry thundered down from the highlands. Archers emerged from behind rocky outcrops and tree lines, raining arrows onto the Mongol flanks. The supposedly defeated vanguard under Baybars suddenly wheeled around and counterattacked, no longer retreating but advancing with renewed vigour. The Mongols found themselves caught in a perfect envelopment, attacked from three sides by an enemy that vastly outnumbered them and held superior position. This was every commander's nightmare. Tactical disadvantage compounded by terrain disadvantage, with no clear line of retreat. The situation that a moment before had seemed like certain victory had transformed into potential catastrophe. But the Mongols were not ordinary soldiers. They were veterans of countless battles, survivors of the most successful military expansion in human history. They did not panic. They did not break. Instead, they fought with the ferocity and discipline that had made them legendary. Mongol warriors pivoted to face threats from multiple directions. Units that had been advancing in pursuit suddenly formed defensive positions. Horse archers who moments before had been shooting at fleeing Mamluks now targeted the fresh enemy forces emerging from the hills. The heavy cavalry, recognizing that envelopment meant close combat was inevitable, prepared to receive the Mamluk charge. The battle now entered its most brutal phase. The Mamluk cavalry smashed into the Mongol formations with devastating impact. Lances shattered against armour and shields. Sabres rose and fell in murderous arcs. Horses collided, their riders grappling hand to hand. The concentrated firepower of massed Mamluk archers created a storm of arrows that found gaps in Mongol armour and killed horses, dismounting warriors and leaving them vulnerable. The Mamluks had several crucial advantages. They outnumbered the Mongols significantly, allowing them to rotate fresh troops into combat, while exhausted Mongol warriors had no reinforcements. Their heavier armour and weapons gave them an edge in close combat. Their horses, though perhaps not as hardy as Mongol ponies, were larger and more powerful, better suited for the shock cavalry tactics that dominated this phase of the battle. Most importantly, they held the terrain, attacking from higher ground and maintaining the ability to maneuver while the Mongols were compressed into an increasingly small space. Contemporary accounts describe the Mamluks using early hand cannons called midfa, though their effectiveness was limited. The true purpose of these primitive firearms was not to kill Mongol warriors, but to frighten their horses. The loud reports and flashes of fire could panic animals, disrupting Mongol formations and creating opportunities for Mamluk cavalry charges. Whether these weapons were actually used or are an exaggeration by later chroniclers remains debated, but they illustrate the Mamluk willingness to employ any tactical advantage available. The Mongols began to suffer heavy casualties. Warriors fell to arrow fire. Cavalry charges broke Mongol formations. The numerical disadvantage, sustainable in open terrain with room to maneuver, became critical in the constrained space of the ambush zone. Mongol discipline began to fracture not because of cowardice, but because tactical options were disappearing. The Mongol left wing, which had been positioned to envelop the Mamluk flank, was hit by a devastating counterattack. Sultan Qutuz himself, recognizing a critical moment in the battle, stripped troops from his right flank and personally led them across the battlefield to reinforce the left. According to Mamluk chroniclers, Qutuz threw down his helmet so his men could recognize him, rode to the front of the formation, and gave an inspiring speech calling on his warriors to fight in the name of Islam. Whether this account is literally true or propaganda embellishment, the effect was real. The Mamluk left wing held, then counterattacked with renewed vigour. The Mongol cavalry that had been threatening to turn the Mamluk flank was driven back with heavy losses. The battle began to turn decisively in the Mamluks' favour. Kitbuka recognised that his army was facing annihilation. Retreat was the only logical option, to break contact, withdraw from the killing zone, and regroup. Some of his officers urged him to order the withdrawal before it was too late, but Kitbuka refused. According to Mamluk accounts, which treat him with considerable respect despite being their enemy, Kitbuka chose death in battle over retreat and shame. Whether this was courage, fatalism, or calculation that retreat would be impossible anyway, Kitbuka ordered his men to fight to the end. The Mongol resistance remained fierce even as their tactical situation became hopeless. Units fought until they were overwhelmed. Warriors who lost their horses continued fighting on foot. The battle raged from dawn until midday, hours of sustained combat that left the valley floor littered with dead and dying men and horses. Eventually, sheer numbers and tactical advantage overwhelmed even Mongol determination. The Mongol formations began to disintegrate. Warriors attempted to flee toward Basin, 8 miles away, hoping to reach a defensible position, or at least escape complete destruction. The Mamluks pursued relentlessly. Cavalry ran down fleeing Mongols. Archers shot those who tried to surrender. Infantry, including Bedouin auxiliaries and Arab levies, emerged from hiding to kill Mongol stragglers. It was slaughter more than battle at this point, the grim final act of a fight that had been decided hours before. Kitbuka himself was captured during the rout. The exact circumstances are unclear, but he was brought, bound, before Sultan Qutuz. Even in defeat and captivity, Kitbuka remained defiant. He taunted Qutuz and the Mamluk emirs, declaring that Hulagu would return with overwhelming force to avenge this defeat, and that Egypt's gates would shake with the thunder of Mongol cavalry. He compared his own loyalty to his master with the Mamluks' history of betraying their Ayyubid rulers. These were not words calculated to win mercy. Qutuz ordered Kitbuka's immediate execution. The veteran Mamluk warrior Jamal al-Din Kush al-Shamsi carried out the sentence, beheading the Mongol general on or near the battlefield. Kitbuka's death marked the end of organised Mongol resistance. The surviving Mongols fled northeast toward the Euphrates, abandoning Syria to the victorious Mamluks. The Mamluks pursued to Basin, where the remnants of the Mongol army attempted to make one final stand. But with Kitbuka dead, their numbers decimated and no hope of reinforcement, this last resistance was quickly crushed. Some Mongols escaped to carry news of the disaster back to Hulagu. Others died fighting. Many were captured and executed. The Battle of Ain Jalut was over. For the first time in 43 years of westward expansion, a Mongol army had been decisively defeated in open battle, and the defeat had not been subsequently avenged. The invincible were shown to be mortal. The tide that had seemed unstoppable had been halted. The significance of what had happened would only become clear in the months and years that followed, but contemporaries recognized immediately that something momentous had occurred. Sultan Qutuz and his victorious army did not linger to celebrate. They immediately moved north to exploit their victory. Damascus, which had surrendered to the Mongols in March, was liberated in October 1260. The Mongol garrisons scattered across Syria were hunted down and destroyed. The Armenian and Georgian forces that had fought alongside the Mongols withdrew to their homelands. Within weeks, Mamluk control over Syria was firmly established. But Qutuz would not enjoy his triumph for long. On the journey back to Cairo, he was assassinated, probably on the orders of Baybars. The exact circumstances remain murky. Some sources suggest Qutuz had promised Baybars the governorship of Aleppo as reward for his crucial role in the victory, but had reneged on that promise. Others suggest Qutuz recognized Baybars as too ambitious and too dangerous, planning to eliminate him first, and Baybars struck preemptively. Whatever the truth, Qutuz died, and Baybars became the new Sultan of Egypt. As Sultan, Baybars proved to be a brilliant, ruthless, and effective ruler. He immediately turned his attention to the Crusader states, ostensibly because Antioch had aided the Mongols, but really because Baybars understood that the Crusaders, weakened and divided, could be systematically destroyed now that the Mongol threat had receded. Over the following years, Baybars would capture numerous Crusader cities, Jaffa in 1268, Antioch in 1268, and Ascalon in 1270, which he destroyed so thoroughly it was never rebuilt. These conquests put the Crusader states into terminal decline. Within 30 years, the last Crusader holdings in the Holy Land would fall. The strategic consequences of Ain Jalut extended far beyond the immediate battlefield. The Mongol Ilkhanate, the state founded by Hulagu in Persia, never again seriously threatened Egypt. Hulagu attempted to avenge Kitbuka's defeat, sending a force of about 12,000 men back into Syria in December 1260. But this expedition was poorly timed and inadequately supported. The Mamluks defeated it at the First Battle of Homs. Further Mongol invasions followed over the years, in 1280 to 1281 under Abarka Khan, and briefly in 1299-3 under Ghazan Khan, when Mongol forces temporarily recaptured Damascus. But these were ultimately unsuccessful. The Mamluks held, and the border between the Ilkhanate and the Mamluk Sultanate stabilized at the Euphrates River. Part of the reason Hulagu could never muster overwhelming force against the Mamluks was because he faced threats closer to home. His cousin Berk Khan, ruler of the Golden Horde to the north, had converted to Islam and was horrified by the destruction of Baghdad and the execution of the Caliph. Berk signed a treaty with the Mamluks and went to war with his fellow Mongol Hulagu. The Mongol Empire, which had been the largest contiguous land empire in history, was fracturing into rival khanates that fought each other as much as they fought external enemies. This internal Mongol conflict was one of the factors that prevented Ain Jalut from being avenged. In Mongol military history, defeats were temporary setbacks. The Mongol pattern was to absorb a loss, regroup with overwhelming force, return, and annihilate the enemy that had dared to resist. This had happened repeatedly across Eurasia. Ain Jalut was the first major exception to that pattern. The Mongols could not return with overwhelming force because their empire was consuming itself in civil wars and succession disputes. For the Islamic world, Ain Jalut was psychological salvation as much as military victory. After Baghdad fell, after the Caliph was killed, after Syria was conquered, it had seemed possible that Islam itself might be extinguished, its cities reduced to ruins, its people slaughtered or enslaved, its holy places desecrated by pagan conquerors. Ain Jalut proved that resistance was not futile. The Mongols could be beaten. Their tactics could be countered. Their aura of invincibility was a lie. The Mamluks became heroes of Islam, defenders of the faith against the infidel hordes. Baybars, despite being a usurper and a murderer, was celebrated as a champion. Later generations would embellish his story into legend, attributing to him feats of strength and cunning that verged on the supernatural. The historical Baybars was ruthless, pragmatic, and occasionally cruel, but he was also an effective military leader and administrator who rebuilt Mamluk power and secured the Islamic heartland against both Mongol and Crusader threats. The battle also had interesting effects on military doctrine. Mamluk military treatises written in the decades after Ain Jalut analyse Mongol tactics in detail and offer countermeasures. These documents provide valuable insight into medieval cavalry warfare and demonstrate that the Mamluks understood they had defeated the Mongols not through some accident, but through superior understanding of terrain, tactics, and psychology. They had turned Mongol methods against the Mongols themselves. Modern historians debate the true significance of Ain Jalut. Some argue it was a genuinely pivotal battle that saved Islam and Western Europe from Mongol conquest. If the Mamluks had lost, Egypt would have fallen. With Egypt conquered, the Mongols would have controlled the entire Middle East and North Africa. From there, they could have potentially invaded Europe from the south, while other Mongol armies attacked from the east, creating a strategic nightmare for European Christendom already weakened by decades of internal conflict. Other historians are more sceptical of Ain Jalut's world historical importance. They argue that Mongol expansion had already reached its natural limits by 1260. The Mongol military system was optimized for the steppes of Central Asia, where grass was abundant to feed the thousands of horses each Mongol army required, where the open terrain allowed maximum use of their mobility and archery, and where the sparse population provided limited opportunities for resistance. In the more densely populated, heavily forested or mountainous regions, Mongol tactics were less effective. Egypt would have been particularly challenging to conquer and hold. Its geography, dependent on the Nile River Valley with vast deserts on either side, created defensive advantages. Its large, complex urban population could not be easily cowed by mass slaughter, as nomadic or agricultural peoples could be. The logistics of maintaining a large Mongol army in Egypt, far from the Eurasian steppes that were their heartland, would have been prohibitively difficult. Moreover, the Mongol Empire's own internal contradictions were becoming apparent by 1260. The empire was too vast to be governed effectively as a single entity. Succession disputes were endemic, and different branches of Genghis Khan's family were already competing for power. Even if Hulagu had conquered Egypt, it is unclear whether he could have held it while also managing conflicts with rival Mongol Khanates, suppressing rebellions in Persia, and dealing with resurgent powers in Central Asia. Nevertheless, Ain Jalut remained significant regardless of these counterfactual arguments. It was a tactical masterpiece, a textbook example of how to defeat a superior enemy through superior use of terrain, deception, and concentration of force at the decisive point. It demonstrated that the Mamluks, often dismissed as mere slave soldiers, were actually one of the most effective military organizations of the medieval period, and it established a geopolitical reality that would endure for centuries, a stable border between the Mongol Ilkhanate and the Mamluk Sultanate, with neither side able to destroy the other. The battlefield at Ain Jalut is relatively quiet today. The modern town of Ain Jalut stands near the ancient site. The valley that once echoed with the thunder of hooves and the screams of dying men is now farmland. Few physical traces of the battle remain. Unlike European battlefields that are carefully preserved and memorialized, Ain Jalut has no elaborate monuments, no plaques describing troop positions, no museums filled with artifacts excavated from the earth. Yet the battle's legacy endures in the historical consciousness of the Middle East. It is remembered as a moment when the seemingly inevitable was resisted and overcome, when careful planning and courage triumphed over reputation and past success. For the Mamluks, it was the foundational victory that legitimized their rule and established them as the defenders of Islam. For the Mongols, it was the first clear sign that their expansion had limits, and that some enemies could not be subdued through terror and force alone. The warriors who fought at Ain Jalut could not have known they were participating in one of history's decisive battles. They fought for immediate reasons, for survival, for loyalty to their commanders, for booty and glory, for religious faith or ethnic identity. But their actions shaped the future in ways they could not have imagined. The Mamluk victory ensured that Islam would survive as a major world religion, with a powerful state to protect it. It guaranteed that the Mediterranean world would remain divided between Christian Europe and the Islamic Middle East, rather than unified under Mongol rule. It demonstrated that nomadic conquerors from the steppes could be beaten by disciplined professional military organizations. September 3rd, 1260 began with the sun rising over a valley in Galilee, where two armies prepared to decide the fate of nations. It ended with one army destroyed and its commander dead, the other victorious and the master of Syria. Between sunrise and sunset, the course of history shifted. The Mongol advance was halted, the Islamic world was saved, and a battle that lasted only hours achieved consequences that endured for centuries. The spring of Goliath had witnessed another giant fall. This time, however, it was not a single warrior who was defeated, but an entire empire's ambitions. The Mamluk cavalry had faced the Mongol horde, and had not merely survived but triumphed. The thunder of hooves at Ain Jalut echoed through the ages, a reminder that no power, no matter how seemingly invincible, is truly unstoppable when confronted by courage, skill, and the determination to resist. The aftermath of Ain Jalut rippled outward from that blood-soaked valley in ways that contemporaries could scarcely have predicted. As the Mamluk army marched north in the weeks following their victory, they encountered a landscape transformed by just 7 months of Mongol occupation. Damascus, which had surrendered without resistance in March, now welcomed its liberators with genuine jubilation, mixed with fear about what retribution might follow for those who had collaborated with the enemy. Baybars and Kutus entered Damascus on October 28, 1260, less than 2 months after the battle. The city's notables came out to greet them with elaborate ceremonies, swearing renewed allegiance to Muslim rule. But the Mamluk commanders were not naive about the complexities of occupation and collaboration. Many Damascus residents had served the Mongols, some willingly as administrators and tax collectors, others under compulsion simply to survive. The returning Mamluk forces had to make difficult decisions about punishment and forgiveness. The Christian communities of Damascus faced particular danger. They had welcomed the Mongols as liberators, seeing in Kitbuka's Nestorian Christianity a sign that their own fortunes might improve under Mongol rule. The Armenian and Georgian troops that fought alongside the Mongols had been billeted in Christian quarters. Churches had remained open and even prospered during the brief Mongol period, while mosques were sometimes neglected or converted to other uses. Now the situation was reversed, and Christian civilians feared massive retaliation. What actually occurred was more measured than the Christians had feared, but still brutal by modern standards. Some prominent Christian collaborators were executed, particularly those who had openly celebrated the fall of Baghdad or participated in Mongol administration. Churches that had been built or renovated during Mongol rule were sometimes destroyed or reconverted to mosques. But wholesale massacre of Christian communities did not occur, partly because the Mamluks needed the Christian merchant class for economic recovery, and partly because religious scholars issued fatwas distinguishing between Christians who had actively aided the enemy and those who had merely survived under occupation. The Jewish communities faced similar reckonings. Some Jews had served Mongol administrators, using their commercial networks and literacy to facilitate governance. Others had simply continued their traditional roles as merchants, physicians, and craftsmen. The Mamluk restoration brought investigations, occasional confiscations of property, and some executions, but again the response was calibrated rather than indiscriminate. The Mamluks understood that economic recovery required preserving the commercial infrastructure that Jews and Christians provided. Aleppo, which had suffered catastrophic destruction during the Mongol siege in January, presented a different challenge. The city's population had been massacred, its fortifications breached, its economic life utterly destroyed. When Mamluk forces reoccupied Aleppo in October 1260, they found a ghost city, corpses still lying in the streets 9 months after the slaughter, buildings collapsed and burned, the famous souks that had made Aleppo one of the great trading centres of the Islamic world reduced to rubble. The Mamluk governors faced the enormous task of rebuilding from almost nothing. Survivors who had fled to the countryside were encouraged to return with promises of tax relief and protection. Craftsmen and merchants from other cities were offered incentives to relocate to Aleppo. Labour gangs were organised to clear debris and rebuild fortifications. The process would take decades, and Aleppo never fully recovered its pre-Mongol prosperity, but slowly life returned to the ruined city. The speed of Mamluk reconquest of Syria surprised everyone, including probably the Mamluks themselves. Within 3 months of Ain Jalut, essentially all of Syria was back under Egyptian control. Mongol garrisons that had been scattered across the region, never large to begin with and now isolated and demoralised, either fled back across the Euphrates or were hunted down and destroyed. The Georgian and Armenian troops that had fought for the Mongols withdrew to their homelands in the Caucasus, some harassed by Kurdish and Turkoman raiders along the way. But re-establishing control was only the first challenge. The Mamluks had to convince the population that they could actually defend Syria against the inevitable Mongol counterattack. Hulagu had withdrawn temporarily, but everyone assumed he would return with overwhelming force once his political situation in Persia was secure. The Mongols always avenged defeats. The pattern had held true across Eurasia for 40 years. Why would Syria be different? Qutuz and his emirs recognized this psychological challenge. They had won one battle, but sustaining a defensive posture against a resurgent Mongol invasion would require more than military preparation. It required convincing the Syrian population that resistance was sustainable, that Mamluk protection was real and permanent, that the choice was not between Mongol rule and Mongol rule postponed, but between Mongol rule and genuine independence. Under Muslim sovereignty, the Mamluks implemented several policies designed to build legitimacy and popular support. They reduced taxes that the Ayyubids and later the Mongols had levied, providing immediate economic relief. They restored Waqf properties, the religious endowments that funded mosques, schools, and charitable institutions which had been confiscated or mismanaged under Mongol occupation. They appointed local notables to administrative positions, creating a class of Syrians with vested interests in Mamluk rule. They patronized religious scholars and institutions, positioning themselves as defenders of Sunni Islam against both Mongol paganism and Shia heterodoxy. These efforts were interrupted dramatically by Qutuz's assassination on October 23, 1260, during the return journey to Egypt. The murder occurred near Salihiyah in the Egyptian delta, far from the Syrian territories Qutuz had just liberated. The conspiracy involved several Mamluk emirs, but Baybars was clearly the principal organizer and beneficiary. The exact circumstances remain disputed by medieval chroniclers and modern historians. Some sources claim Qutuz was hunting when he was ambushed by conspirators who had hidden among the reeds. Other accounts suggest he was killed in his tent during an evening halt. All sources agree that Baybars was present, and that he either delivered the fatal blow himself or ordered it done immediately in his presence. The traditional explanation for the assassination centres on the governorship of Aleppo. Qutuz had allegedly promised this lucrative and strategically vital position to Baybars as reward for his crucial role at Ain Jalut. But after the victory, Qutuz either reneged on the promise or delayed implementation, perhaps recognizing that giving Baybars control of Syria's second city would create a dangerously powerful rival. Baybars, feeling betrayed and ambitious for greater power, organized the conspiracy. A more complex interpretation suggests that Qutuz himself was planning to eliminate Baybars. The relationship between these two men was fraught with mutual distrust born of years of political maneuvering. Both were ambitious, capable, and ruthless. Both understood that only one could ultimately dominate the Mamluk system. Qutuz may have moved first, or rather, may have signalled his intention to move, and Baybars responded preemptively. Whatever the truth, Qutuz died, and Baybars became sultan. The transition was remarkably smooth, suggesting that Baybars had prepared the ground carefully. Other senior emirs, who might have challenged him, either supported the coup or remained neutral. The Mamluk rank and file, more concerned with pay and plunder than dynastic loyalty, accepted the new sultan without protest. Within days, Baybars was issuing orders as the undisputed ruler of Egypt and Syria. As sultan, Baybars proved himself one of the most effective rulers in Mamluk history. His reign from 1260 to 1270 even transformed the Mamluk Sultanate from a fragile state that had narrowly avoided destruction into a regional superpower that dominated the eastern Mediterranean. His policies were calculated to maximize military effectiveness, while building the economic and political foundations necessary to sustain long-term defense against Mongol threats. Baybars' first priority was fortifying Syria against the expected Mongol counterattack. He invested heavily in rebuilding and strengthening fortifications at key cities. Aleppo, despite its devastated condition, received particular attention because of its position on the frontier. Damascus had its walls repaired and expanded. Coastal cities were fortified against both Mongol land attacks and potential Crusader amphibious assaults. These projects required enormous resources, skilled engineers, and thousands of labourers, but Baybars understood that static defences, while never sufficient alone, were necessary components of a comprehensive defensive strategy. He also reformed and expanded the Mamluk military system. The core royal Mamluks were supplemented by recruiting additional slave soldiers from the Caucasus and Central Asian steppes. These recruits underwent the intensive Furusiyya training program that produced the elite cavalry who had won at Ain Jalut. Baybars also regularized the auxiliary forces, the Bedouin scouts, the Turkoman light cavalry, and the various Arab levies, integrating them more effectively into the overall command structure. Communications and intelligence were systematized. Baybars established a relay system of mounted couriers that could carry messages from Damascus to Cairo in 4 days, an impressive speed that allowed rapid coordination between Syrian and Egyptian forces. He created an extensive spy network that penetrated the Mongol Ilkhanate, the Crusader states, and the various smaller powers of the region. This intelligence gathering gave the Mamluks advance warning of threats and detailed information about enemy capabilities and intentions. The Mongol counterattack came in December 1260, far sooner than anyone expected. Hulagu, despite being embroiled in conflicts with the Golden Horde and dealing with succession politics within the broader Mongol Empire, dispatched a force back into Syria to avenge Kitbuka and reassert Mongol authority. This army, numbering perhaps 12,000 men, was commanded by generals whose names are recorded in various chronicles, but whose exact identities remain somewhat uncertain. The Mongol strategy was to strike quickly before the Mamluks could fully consolidate their control over Syria. They crossed the Euphrates in winter, a difficult and risky maneuver, but one that achieved surprise. The Mongols recaptured several towns in northern Syria and laid siege to Aleppo, which was still recovering from the earlier devastation and was vulnerable to another assault. Baybars responded with characteristic speed and decisiveness. He mobilized the Egyptian army and force-marched to Syria, covering the distance in remarkably short time. By late December, Mamluk forces were converging on Aleppo to relieve the siege. The two armies met at the First Battle of Homs on December 10th, 1260, just 3 months after Ain Jalut. This second engagement differed significantly from the first. The Mongols were now aware of Mamluk capabilities and tactics. They knew about the feigned retreat and would not fall for it again. They were also operating with a smaller force, which reduced their offensive power but improved their ability to maneuver and avoid encirclement. The battle was hard fought, and its outcome less decisive than Ain Jalut had been. Contemporary sources provide conflicting accounts of the battle's result. Some Mamluk chronicles claim a clear victory, with the Mongol army routed and forced to retreat across the Euphrates. Mongol and allied sources suggest a more ambiguous outcome, with both armies suffering significant casualties and the Mongols withdrawing in reasonable order rather than fleeing in panic. The most reliable assessment seems to be that the Mamluks achieved a tactical success, forcing the Mongol withdrawal and relieving Aleppo, but did not inflict the kind of catastrophic defeat that had occurred at Ain Jalut. What mattered strategically was that the Mongols again failed to reconquer Syria. The attempted counterstroke had been turned back. The Syrian population, watching to see whether Mamluk protection was real or illusory, received confirmation that the Egyptians could and would defend them. This psychological victory was as important as the tactical outcome of the battle itself. Hulagu attempted no further invasions during his lifetime. he was increasingly preoccupied with the conflict against Burqa Khan of the Golden Horde, a war between Mongol cousins that consumed enormous resources and attention. The alliance between the Golden Horde and the Mamluks, formalized by treaties and diplomatic exchanges, created a strategic vice that squeezed the Ilkhanate from two directions. Hulagu could not concentrate overwhelming force against Egypt because he had to maintain large armies facing north toward Burqa's domains. This geopolitical situation created breathing space for the Mamluks to consolidate control over Syria and turn their attention to their other enemies, the Crusader states. Here Baybars would demonstrate the full range of his military and diplomatic capabilities, waging a systematic campaign that would reduce the Crusaders from a significant regional presence to isolated coastal enclaves clinging to survival. The Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem, or what remained of it after 2 centuries of intermittent warfare, was by 1260 a shadow of its former self. The kingdom no longer controlled Jerusalem, which Saladin had recaptured in 1187. The Crusader presence consisted of coastal cities and fortresses: Acre, Jaffa, Caesarea, Sidon, Tyre, Antioch, and the great castle fortifications like Krak des Chevaliers, and Margat that dominated key routes and territories. These holdings were maintained by a complex web of military orders: the Knights Templar, the Knights Hospitaller, and the Teutonic Knights, along with local barons of European descent and merchant communities from Italian city-states, Venice, Genoa, and Pisa, whose commercial interests in Eastern Mediterranean trade made them stakeholders in Crusader survival. The military orders in particular were formidable, possessing fortresses that were architectural marvels of defensive engineering, garrisoned by warrior monks whose religious fanaticism made them tenacious defenders. The Crusader states had survived as long as they had, partly through military prowess, but more significantly through diplomatic maneuvering, playing Muslim powers against each other and negotiating truces when necessary. They had remained neutral during the Mongol invasion, a pragmatic choice that had earned them Mamluk tolerance during the crisis. But Baybars had not forgotten that Antioch and its ruler Bohemond VI had actively allied with the Mongols and provided troops that fought at Ain Jalut. In 1263, Baybars began his systematic reduction of Crusader power. His strategy was methodical, targeting smaller, more vulnerable positions first to accumulate experience, resources, and momentum before attacking the major fortifications. The campaign would span more than a decade and involve dozens of sieges, raids, and battles. The castle of Albira was captured in 1263 after a brief siege. Caesarea fell in 1265 after a siege that demonstrated improved Mamluk siege engineering capabilities. The defenders, a mixture of Crusader knights and local militia, held out for just 7 days before the walls were breached and the city stormed. Baybars ordered the systematic destruction of Caesarea's fortifications so it could never again serve as a Crusader stronghold. Arsa fell in 1265 after a longer and more difficult siege. The Knights Hospitaller garrisoning the fortress fought with desperate courage, knowing that surrender would likely mean enslavement or execution. When the walls finally collapsed under bombardment from Mamluk catapults and the garrison's food supplies were exhausted, the survivors attempted to negotiate terms. Baybars initially offered safe conduct, then reportedly reneged after the gates were opened, massacring many defenders and enslaving the rest. Whether this betrayal actually occurred or is Crusader propaganda remains debated, but it certainly contributed to the growing terror that preceded Mamluk attacks. The fall of Arsuf demonstrated Baybars' siegecraft capabilities. The Mamluks had learned from their enemies, adopting and improving European siege techniques. They constructed massive trebuchets that could hurl stones weighing hundreds of pounds against fortifications. They employed sappers who would dig tunnels beneath walls, shore them up with wooden beams, then set fire to the supports, causing the walls to collapse. They used mantlets, mobile wooden shields that protected assault troops during attacks. They coordinated archery barrages with assault waves, suppressing defender fire at critical moments. In 1266, Baybars turned his attention to Safed, a Templar fortress in Galilee that had been nearly impregnable. The castle stood on a mountain peak with commanding views of the surrounding territory. Its massive walls and towers had been built to the highest standards of Crusader military architecture. Its garrison consisted of veteran Templar knights, supported by local Christian militia, and Turkopil auxiliaries, local Christians who fought as light cavalry. The siege of Safed lasted 6 weeks. Baybars brought overwhelming force, perhaps 10,000 men, including engineers, sappers, and specialized siege troops. The Mamluks constructed 4 massive siege towers that allowed attackers to reach the height of the walls. They built trebuchets that maintained constant bombardment. They attempted to undermine the walls through tunneling, though the rocky mountain terrain made this difficult. The defenders resisted fiercely. Templar knights, bound by religious vows never to retreat or surrender unless outnumbered 3-1, fought with suicidal determination. They launched nighttime counterattacks against Mamluk siege works, burning siege towers and killing sappers. They endured constant bombardment and starvation rations, but they were slowly worn down by the relentless Mamluk pressure. When the walls were finally breached and the Templars' position became hopeless, they negotiated surrender terms. Baybars promised safe conduct for the garrison if they vacated the fortress. The surviving Templars, perhaps 2,000 men including knights and auxiliaries, marched out under truce, and then, according to most sources, Baybars again betrayed the agreement. The Templars were surrounded and given a choice: convert to Islam or die. Those who refused were beheaded. Only a few who converted were spared, though their fates under Mamluk rule were hardly enviable. Again, the historicity of this betrayal is disputed. Mamluk sources either deny it occurred or justify it by claiming the Templars had themselves violated truce terms. Crusader sources, written by survivors and chroniclers traumatized by the losses, emphasize Mamluk treachery. What is certain is that Safed fell, its garrison was destroyed, and the fortress was subsequently demolished so thoroughly that it could never again threaten Mamluk control of Galilee. Jaffa fell in 1268. The coastal city, important for its port facilities and agricultural hinterland, was taken after a swift siege. The Mamluk army arrived, surrounded the city, and launched immediate assaults before reinforcements could arrive from Acre. The walls were breached within days. The defenders, overwhelmed by the speed and ferocity of the attack, were killed or enslaved. Baybars ordered Jaffa's fortifications razed. These systematic demolitions were central to Baybars' strategy. Unlike earlier Muslim reconquests that had sometimes preserved Crusader fortifications for their own use, Baybars was determined to eliminate defensive infrastructure that could ever again support a Christian military presence. Coastal cities were particularly targeted because they could be resupplied and reinforced by sea from Cyprus or Europe. By destroying ports and fortifications, Baybars ensured that even if Crusaders temporarily reoccupied territory, they would find no defensible positions to hold. The climax of Baybars' early anti-Crusader campaigns came in 1268 with the fall of Antioch, one of the oldest and most important Crusader states. Antioch had been captured in 1098 during the First Crusade and had remained in Christian hands for 170 years. Its ruler, Bohemond VI, was the same prince who had allied with the Mongols and sent troops to fight at Ain Jalut. Baybars had not forgotten this betrayal. The siege of Antioch in May 1268 was brief but devastating. Bohemond was absent in Tripoli when the Mamluk army appeared. The defenders, numbering perhaps 6,000 including garrison troops and armed citizens, prepared for a long siege. They had ample food stores, strong walls, and confidence born of successfully resisting previous Muslim attacks. But Baybars had brought overwhelming force and had refined his siege tactics through years of experience. The Mamluk assault was swift and brutal. Siege towers and trebuchets bombarded the walls continuously. Sappers worked around the clock to undermine fortifications, and on May 18th, just 4 days after the siege began, the walls were breached in multiple locations simultaneously. Mamluk troops poured through the gaps. What followed was one of the worst massacres of the Crusader period. Contemporary estimates, always suspect but indicative of scale, suggest that 17,000 civilians and soldiers were killed and another 100,000 enslaved. These numbers are almost certainly exaggerated, as Antioch's population was probably not large enough to sustain such losses. But even accounting for medieval hyperbole, the destruction was clearly immense. Baybars' letter to Bohemond describing the fall of Antioch has been preserved and is one of the most chilling documents of medieval warfare. Written in elaborate, mocking prose, it describes in graphic detail the slaughter of Bohemond's subjects, the violation of churches, the enslavement of women and children. The letter's purpose was to terrorize, to demonstrate that resistance to Mamluk power was futile, and that those who had aided the Mongols would pay a terrible price. After Antioch, the remaining Crusader states were clearly living on borrowed time. Acre remained the last major Crusader city, along with a few fortresses and smaller settlements, but these were isolated positions without strategic depth, dependent on sea communications with Cyprus and Europe for survival. The military orders, though still formidable in their great castles like Krak des Chevaliers and Marga, could delay but not prevent their eventual fall. The castle of Krak des Chevaliers, considered one of the finest examples of medieval military architecture, fell to Baybars in 1271 after a siege that showcased the culmination of Mamluk siege warfare evolution. The castle, held by the Knights Hospitaller, had been besieged unsuccessfully multiple times over the previous century. Its massive concentric walls, its position on a commanding hilltop, and its well-stocked supplies made it seem impregnable. Baybars arrived with perhaps 20,000 men and a siege train that included the largest trebuchets yet built. The bombardment lasted for weeks, systematically destroying towers and walls. Sappers undermined sections of fortification. Assault troops launched repeated attacks that were beaten back with heavy casualties, but which gradually exhausted the defenders. The Hospitaller garrison, numbering perhaps 2,000 including knights and auxiliaries, fought with the expected determination, but they were slowly starved and worn down. After more than a month, with their position hopeless and no relief force appearing, they negotiated surrender. This time, Baybars honoured the terms. The garrison was allowed to march out and travel to Tripoli. Whether this mercy reflected genuine respect for their defence or simple pragmatism, recognising that other fortresses would resist more fiercely if they knew surrender meant certain death, remains unclear. Margat, the last great Hospitaller castle, fell in 1285, after Baybars' death, but following the strategic pattern he had established. Castle after castle, city after city, the Crusader presence in the Holy Land was systematically eliminated. The final act came in 1291 when Acre, the last significant Crusader city, fell after a siege that involved tens of thousands of Mamluk troops and months of fighting. With Acre's fall, the Crusader period in the Holy Land effectively ended. Small outposts remained briefly, but the European Christian military presence had been eliminated. This campaign of conquest was possible only because Baybars had secured the Mamluk northern frontier against Mongol invasion. The two theatres of war were intimately connected in his strategic planning. Every fortress taken from the Crusaders was one less potential Mongol ally, one less base that could support an invasion from the north, one less complication if Hulagu or his successors renewed their attempts to conquer Syria and Egypt. The Mongol threat remained very real throughout Baybars' reign. Hulagu died in 1265, but his son Abakar Khan, who succeeded him, was equally determined to avenge the defeats at Ain Jalut and Homs. Abakar inherited a powerful state, the Ilkhanates that controlled Persia, Iraq, and parts of Anatolia, with resources and manpower that dwarfed what the Mamluks could mobilize. The question was never whether the Mongols would invade again, but when. The invasion came in 1277. Late in Baybars' reign, Abakar assembled a massive army. Contemporary estimates range from 80,000 to 100,000 men, though modern historians suggest 40,000 to 60,000 is more realistic, and marched west into Anatolia and then south towards Syria. This was the largest Mongol force to invade the region since Hulagu's original conquest, and it posed an existential threat to Mamluk power. Baybars mobilized every available resource. He called up the full Royal Mamluk Corps, mobilized auxiliary forces throughout Egypt and Syria, and even negotiated temporary truces with some Crusader positions to ensure they would not interfere. The Mamluk army that assembled to meet the Mongol invasion numbered perhaps 30,000 to 40,000 men, a substantial force but still outnumbered by the invaders. The two armies met near Elbistan in southeastern Anatolia in April 1277. The battle was fierce and lasted an entire day. Unlike Ain Jalut, where Mamluk tactical brilliance and superior use of terrain had compensated for numerical parity or slight disadvantage, at Elbistan the Mamluks faced a genuinely larger enemy force in relatively open terrain that favoured Mongol mobility. The battle began with the characteristic Mongol horse archer attacks, waves of light cavalry loosing arrows at long range, then wheeling away before the Mamluks could close for melee combat. This was the tactic that had destroyed armies from China to Hungary, and it remained devastatingly effective. The Mamluk formations absorbed punishment, arrows finding gaps in armour, killing horses, wounding men. But the Mamluks had learned from 17 years of fighting Mongols. Their heavy cavalry was better armoured than most Mongol opponents had been. Their own horse archers could return fire effectively, and critically, they maintained formation discipline even under intense pressure, not allowing the Mongol harassment to break their cohesion. When the Mongol heavy cavalry committed to decisive engagement, the battle transformed into a massive melee. Thousands of horsemen crashed together in swirling combats that fragmented into hundreds of individual duels and small unit actions. Sabres rose and fell, lances shattered, men and horses screamed and died. The battle became a test of endurance, which army could sustain losses and maintain morale longer. Slowly the Mamluks began to gain the advantage. Their superior armour and weapons gave them an edge in close combat. Their training in the Furusiyya system had prepared them for exactly this kind of brutal, sustained melee. And crucially, Mamluk morale held while Mongol confidence began to crack. These Mongols were not the hardened veterans of Genghis Khan's era, who had conquered half the world. They were second and third generation warriors who had grown up hearing stories of their ancestors' invincibility, but who had themselves experienced defeat at Ain Jalut and Homs. As casualties mounted, and the Mamluk line refused to break, the Mongol army began to waver. Individual units broke contact and withdrew. The coordinated Mongol attacks became less frequent. And finally, as evening approached and both armies were exhausted, the Mongols disengaged completely and began a fighting withdrawal. Abaka's army retreated north back across the Euphrates. The Mamluks, too exhausted and depleted to mount an effective pursuit, let them go. Both sides claimed victory. The Mongols pointed out that they had not been routed, that they had withdrawn in good order, and that they had inflicted severe casualties on the Mamluks. The Mamluks countered that they had defended Syrian territory successfully, that the Mongol invasion had failed in its objectives, and that once again, Mamluk arms had prevented Mongol conquest. From a strategic perspective, Elbistan was a Mamluk victory. Abaka never seriously threatened Syria again during his reign. The Mongol advance had been checked for a third time. The pattern established at Ain Jalut held. The Mamluks could not invade and conquer the Ilkhanate, but the Mongols could not conquer Syria and Egypt either. The border stabilized at the Euphrates River, a frontier that would persist for decades. Baybars died later that same year in Damascus, possibly from drinking poison kumas, fermented mare's milk, intended for a political enemy, though other accounts suggest natural illness. His death at age 54 ended one of the most consequential reigns in Mamluk history. He had transformed the Sultanate from a desperate survivor into a dominant regional power. He had systematically destroyed Crusader military capacity. He had defended against multiple Mongol invasions, and he had established administrative and military systems that would sustain Mamluk power for another 2.5 centuries. The Mongol-Mamluk conflict continued after Baybar's death, but never again threatened Mamluk existence as seriously as the early campaigns had. Abaka Khan died in 1282. His successor Ahmad Tekuder actually converted to Islam and attempted to negotiate peace with the Mamluks, seeking alliance rather than conquest. This diplomatic overture failed when Tekuder was overthrown by his nephew Arghun, who returned to aggressive anti-Mamluk policies. The most serious late Mongol attempt to conquer Syria came under Ghazan Khan, who ruled the Ilkhanate from 1295 to 1304. Ghazan was an exceptionally capable ruler who converted to Islam himself, making him the first Muslim ruler of the Ilkhanate, and who attempted to use this religious affiliation to win over Syrian Muslims who might otherwise support the Mamluks. In December 1299, Ghazan invaded Syria with a large army. Unlike previous invasions that had been purely military expeditions, this campaign was intended as permanent conquest. Ghazan brought administrators, tax collectors, and the apparatus of government. He intended not just to defeat Mamluk armies, but to occupy and rule Syria as a permanent Ilkhanate province. The Mongol army defeated Mamluk forces at the Third Battle of Homs on December 22, 1299. This was a significant Mongol victory, more decisive than previous battles had been. The Mamluk army was badly mauled and forced to retreat. Damascus fell to the Mongols in late December, and for the first time since 1260, Mongol rule was reimposed on Syria. But Ghazan's position was more precarious than it appeared. His army, though victorious in battle, had suffered significant casualties. His supply lines stretched back across hundreds of miles of hostile territory. Syrian Muslims, despite his own Islamic faith, viewed him as a foreign conqueror and resisted through non-cooperation and occasional violence. And critically, problems in Persia required his attention. By February 1300, just 2 months after conquering Damascus, Ghazan withdrew his army back across the Euphrates. He left behind garrisons, but these isolated forces were systematically destroyed by resurgent Mamluk armies in the following months. Damascus was liberated in April 1300. The Mongol garrisons were hunted down and eliminated, and by summer, Syria was once again firmly under Mamluk control. Ghazan tried again in 1300 and 1303, launching invasions intended to succeed where the previous attempt had failed. But both campaigns ended in withdrawal without achieving permanent conquest. The fundamental problem remained unsolved. The Mongols could defeat Mamluk armies in open battle, but they could not sustain occupation of Syria given their other strategic commitments and the determined resistance they faced. After 1303, serious Mongol attempts to conquer Syria effectively ceased. The Ilkhanate faced increasing internal problems, succession disputes, economic difficulties, and conflicts with other Mongol Khanates. The Mamluks, meanwhile, consolidated their power and refined their defensive capabilities. The border stabilized permanently at the Euphrates. The long-term consequences of Ain Jalut and the Mongol-Mamluk wars extended far beyond the immediate military outcomes. The survival of the Mamluk Sultanate ensured that Islam remained the dominant religion across the Middle East and North Africa. Had the Mongols conquered Egypt, the religious map of the world might have looked very different. The Mongols were religiously tolerant by the standards of their time, and Christianity or other faiths might have expanded in a Mongol-ruled Middle East. The political structure of the region was also shaped by Mamluk victory. The Mamluk system of military slavery, where boys purchased or captured from the Caucasus and Central Asian steppes were trained as elite warriors and could rise to the highest political positions based on military merit, became the dominant model for Islamic states. This system persisted in Egypt until the 19th century and influenced military and political organization throughout the Muslim world. The destruction of the Crusader states, enabled by Mamluk victory over the Mongols, ended 2 centuries of Christian military presence in the Holy Land. The implications for European history were profound. The Crusades had been a defining feature of medieval European politics, society, and culture. Their definitive failure forced Europeans to reconsider their relationship with the Islamic world and contributed to the eventual age of exploration, as Europeans sought alternative routes to Asian trade that did not traverse hostile Muslim territories. The military lessons of Ain Jalut and subsequent battles influenced warfare across Eurasia. The Mamluks demonstrated that Mongol tactics could be countered through superior armour, disciplined formations, and effective use of heavy cavalry. These lessons were studied by other powers facing Mongol threats. The Battle of Ain Jalut was analysed in military treatises written in Arabic, Persian, and eventually Turkish and European languages. The Furusiyya system that produced Mamluk victory became codified in detailed military manuals. These texts, which survive in manuscript form in libraries across the world, describe every aspect of cavalry warfare, horse breeding and training, weapon manufacture and maintenance, archery technique, swordsmanship, lance combat, tactical formations, and even the moral and spiritual preparation of warriors. They represent one of the most comprehensive documentation of medieval military practice from any culture. The economic consequences were equally significant. The Mamluk Sultanate controlled trade routes between Asia and Europe, between the Indian Ocean and the Mediterranean. Spices, silk, and other luxury goods flowed through Mamluk territories, generating customs revenues that funded the military machine. This economic power, combined with military strength, made the Mamluks the dominant force in the eastern Mediterranean for centuries. The Mamluk architectural legacy, visible today in Cairo, Damascus, Aleppo, and Jerusalem, reflects the wealth and cultural sophistication of the Sultanate. Mosques, madrasas, hospitals, and caravanserais built during the Mamluk period rank among the finest examples of Islamic architecture. Many were funded by Waqf endowments established by sultans and emirs who had risen from slavery to positions of enormous power and wealth. The relationship between the Mamluks and the Mongol successor states evolved over time from pure hostility to complex diplomatic engagement. The Ilkhanate converted to Islam in the early 14th century, which reduced religious antagonism even as political rivalry persisted. Trade relations developed. Diplomatic missions were exchanged. By the mid-14th century, the Mamluks and the Ilkhanate were more often allies against mutual enemies than active combatants against each other. This transformation was facilitated by the Black Death, which devastated both states beginning in 1347. The plague, originating in Central Asia and carried along trade routes, killed perhaps 1/3 of the population in both the Mamluk Sultanate and the Ilkhanate. The demographic catastrophe reduced military capacity on both sides and forced a pragmatic accommodation that earlier generations had refused to consider. The Ilkhanate collapsed in the 1330s and 1340s, fragmenting into smaller successor states that lacked the resources to threaten the Mamluks seriously. The unified Mongol threat that had seemed so apocalyptic in 1260 had dissipated. New powers emerged: Timurid empires in Central Asia, Ottoman Turks in Anatolia, Safavid Persians in Iran, each posing different challenges to Mamluk hegemony. Ironically, it was another steppe conqueror who would ultimately humble the Mamluks. Timur, known in the West as Tamerlane, claiming descent from Genghis Khan and consciously modelling himself on Mongol precedents, invaded Syria in 1400. His army defeated Mamluk forces to Aleppo and Damascus, sacked both cities, and temporarily occupied much of Syria. But Timur's empire, like the Mongol Empire before it, fragmented after his death in 1405, and the Mamluks recovered. The final end of Mamluk power came not from steppe conquerors, but from the Ottoman Turks, who defeated the Mamluks at the battles of Majd-Dabik in 1516 and Ridania in 1517. These defeats were partly military. The Ottomans had adopted gunpowder weapons more effectively than the conservative Mamluks, but also reflected deeper systemic problems. The Mamluk system, which had been revolutionary in the 13th century, had become rigid and outdated by the 16th. But for 2.5 centuries, from 1260 to 1517, the Mamluk Sultanate stood as one of the great powers of the medieval world. Its wealth, military capability, and cultural achievements made it a centre of Islamic civilization. And the foundation of that power, the legitimacy that allowed former slave soldiers to rule one of the richest regions on earth, rested on the victory at Ain Jalut. September 3rd, 1260, remained embedded in Islamic historical consciousness as the day the Mongol tide was turned. Medieval chroniclers wrote extensively about the battle, often embellishing details but preserving the essential narrative. Later historians, both Muslim and European, recognized its significance. Modern scholars debate aspects of the battle, the exact numbers involved, the precise sequence of tactical maneuvers, the relative importance compared to other factors in halting Mongol expansion, but none dispute that it was a pivotal moment. For the participants, Ain Jalut was simply survival. The Mamluk warriors who rode into that valley knew they were fighting for their lives, for their nascent sultanate, perhaps for Islam itself. The Mongol warriors who opposed them believed in their own superiority, in the inevitability of their conquest, in the pattern of victory that had held true for 2 generations. One side's certainty was confirmed, the other's was shattered. Kitbuka died defiant, cursing his enemies and prophesying their destruction. His prophecy was wrong. Hulagu never avenged him. The Mongol Empire never conquered Egypt. The Islamic world survived and eventually flourished. But Kitbuka's courage in choosing battle over retreat earned him respect even from his enemies. Mamluk chroniclers, who had every reason to demonize him, instead portrayed him as a worthy adversary who died with honor. Qutuz won the battle but lost his life to his own subordinate within weeks. History remembers him primarily as the Sultan who defeated the Mongols, a single great achievement that overshadows the rest of his brief reign. Whether he was a skilled military commander or simply fortunate to have talented subordinates like Baybars remains debated. What is certain is that he made the crucial decision to fight rather than submit, gambling everything on one battle. Baybars, the most complex of the 3, was simultaneously hero and villain. His military genius is undeniable. His administrative reforms were effective. His building projects were magnificent. But his ruthlessness, his betrayals, his massacres of prisoners who had surrendered under terms of safe conduct stain his legacy. The Arab chroniclers of his own time struggled to reconcile these contradictions, praising his defense of Islam while quietly criticizing his methods. The common soldiers who fought at Ain Jalut, Mamluk and Mongol alike, are mostly anonymous to history. A few names survive in chronicles and military records. Most disappeared into the vast anonymity of medieval warfare. They were the instruments of leaders' ambitions and the victims of historical forces beyond their control or understanding. Yet their courage, skill, and sacrifice determined the outcome of events that shape civilizations. The spring of Goliath, where the battle took place, still exists. The modern town of Ain Jalut sits near the ancient battlefield. Farmers work fields where thousands once died. The blood that soaked into the earth 8 centuries ago has long since washed away. Few physical traces remain of the climactic encounter that decided so much. Occasionally, archaeologists and metal detector enthusiasts find artifacts, arrowheads, fragments of armor, corroded weapons. These remnants, preserved by dry soil and fortunate burial, provide tangible connections to the battle. Museums in Israel and elsewhere hold small collections of these finds, labeled and displayed behind glass, material witnesses to a day that changed history. The battle's legacy persists in Middle Eastern historical consciousness more strongly than in the West. For Arab and Turkish historians, Ain Jalut represents a moment of resistance against overwhelming force, a demonstration that determination and skill can overcome apparent inevitability. The battle is taught in schools, commemorated in popular histories, referenced in political speeches when leaders seek to invoke themes of resistance and victory against superior enemies. In recent decades, some historians have questioned whether Ain Jalut deserves its reputation as a world historical battle. They argue that the Mongol expansion had already reached its natural limits, that geography and logistics would have prevented permanent conquest of Egypt regardless of military outcomes, that internal Mongol politics were more important than battlefield defeats in determining the empire's boundaries. These revisionist interpretations have merit. The Mongols were indeed overextended by 1260. The distances from their Central Asian heartland to Egypt were immense. Maintaining supply lines across thousands of miles of hostile territory would have been extraordinarily difficult. The succession crisis following Munkar Khan's death diverted attention and resources away from westward expansion, and the Golden Horde's conversion to Islam and alliance with the Mamluks created strategic complications that pure military force could not overcome. Yet even granting all these factors, Ain Jalut remained significant. Battles matter not just for their immediate outcomes, but for their psychological and political effects. The Mongol reputation for invincibility was real and powerful. It caused cities to surrender without resistance, armies to flee without fighting, rulers to submit without even token resistance. Breaking that reputation required actual military defeat, demonstrable proof that Mongol armies could be outfought and destroyed. Ain Jalut provided that proof. It demonstrated that Mongol tactics had counters, that Mongol warriors could be killed, that Mongol expansion could be stopped. The battle gave hope to those who would resist and doubt to Mongol commanders who had previously attacked with absolute confidence. These intangible effects are difficult to quantify, but were nonetheless real and important. Moreover, the battle established the Mamluk Sultanate as a legitimate power capable of defending Islam. This legitimacy was crucial for the Sultanate's long-term survival. Medieval Islamic political theory held that rulers derived their authority from their ability to protect the faith and the community of believers. Qutuz and Baybars earned that authority through military victory. Subsequent Mamluk sultans inherited it. The weapons used at Ain Jalut, the composite bows, the curved sabres, the lances and armour, were not substantially different from those used in cavalry warfare for centuries. The true innovation was not technological, but organisational and tactical. The Mamluks had created a professional military system that could match and exceed the Mongol machine through intensive training, strict discipline, and intelligent exploitation of terrain and tactics. This lesson about the primacy of human factors over material factors in warfare resonated through subsequent centuries. Military theorists studying Ain Jalut noted that both sides had essentially equivalent technology. The Mamluks won through better training, better leadership, better tactics, and better morale. These remain the core elements of military effectiveness even in the age of advanced technology. The battle also demonstrated the importance of intelligence and deception in warfare. Baybars' feigned retreat succeeded because the Mongols lacked accurate intelligence about Mamluk dispositions. They did not know that the bulk of the Mamluk army lay concealed in the hills. Their scouts had failed to detect the ambush, and their confidence, born of decades of victory, made them less cautious than they should have been. Modern military education uses Ain Jalut as a case study in deception operations and the exploitation of enemy overconfidence. The battle appears in staff college curricula and military history courses, analysed for its lessons about tactical surprise, economy of force, and the decisive battle of annihilation that Clausewitz would later theorise about. The environmental conditions of the battle are rarely discussed, but were probably significant. September in the Jezreel Valley is hot, with temperatures often exceeding 90 degrees Fahrenheit. Warriors wearing armour, riding hard, fighting for hours, would have suffered from heat exhaustion and dehydration. Access to water from the spring was therefore not just a logistical convenience, but a tactical necessity. The side that controlled the water supply had a significant advantage in a prolonged engagement. The horses too deserve consideration. Cavalry warfare was as much about horses as riders. The thousands of mounts present at Ain Jalut required enormous quantities of water and fodder. Dead and wounded horses littered the battlefield after the fight, their bodies perhaps outnumbering human casualties. The loss of horses could cripple a cavalry force as thoroughly as the loss of riders. The aftermath of battle was always grim. The wounded on both sides suffered and died from their injuries, medieval medicine being unable to treat serious trauma effectively. Bodies were buried in mass graves or left to decompose, creating health hazards for weeks. Scavengers, both animal and human, worked over the battlefield taking anything of value from the dead. This grim reality of warfare is often sanitized in historical accounts, but was an unavoidable part of the experience for those who participated. The psychological trauma of combat, what modern medicine recognizes as post-traumatic stress disorder, must have affected survivors. Warriors who lived through the intensity of close combat, who killed and narrowly avoided being killed, who watched friends and comrades die, carried those experiences for the rest of their lives. Medieval societies had no vocabulary for psychological trauma and no effective treatments, but the conditions certainly existed. Some Mamluk veterans of Ain Jalut went on to long military careers, fighting in subsequent battles against Mongols and Crusaders. Others retired to administrative positions or religious life. A few rose to positions of power and wealth, most probably lived and died in obscurity. Their stories, if they were ever recorded, have not survived. The evening of September 3rd, 1260 saw the battlefield settling into exhausted quiet. The Mongol army had been destroyed. Survivors had fled. The Mamluks, victorious but exhausted, began the necessary tasks of caring for wounded, collecting plunder and organising pursuit. Sultan Qutuz and his emirs gathered to assess what they had achieved. They had won a battle. Whether they had won the war remained to be seen. Hulagu still commanded vast armies in Persia. The Mongol Empire still stretched from China to Eastern Europe. Mongol vengeance had destroyed nations that dared resist. The Mamluks had reason to celebrate their victory, but also reason to fear what might follow. As the sun set over the valley that evening, illuminating a landscape transformed by violence into a field of death, none of the participants could have fully grasped the significance of what had occurred. They knew they had won or lost a battle. They could count casualties and assess immediate tactical outcomes. But they could not know that they had participated in one of history's turning points, a moment when the trajectory of civilization shifted. 8 centuries later, we can see what they could not. The Mongol tide that had swept across Eurasia halted at Ain Jalut. Islam survived as a major world religion. The Mamluk Sultanate endured for 2.5 more centuries. The Crusader states were eliminated. The geopolitical map of the Middle East was redrawn. All of these consequences flowed, directly or indirectly, from the events of that September day in 1260. The spring of Goliath witnessed another giant fall. The Mongols, who had seemed unstoppable, proved mortal. The Mamluks, dismissed by many as mere slave soldiers, proved themselves capable of the highest levels of military achievement. And the Islamic world, which had seemed doomed to Mongol conquest and possible extinction, instead survived and eventually thrived. The cavalry clash at Ain Jalut was not merely a battle. It was the hinge of history, the point where one possible future died and another was born.